Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
BettyJoyce Nash.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Looking forward to speaking with you.
Me too. Thank you so much for coming on the show. So, can you tell me a little bit about your writing?
This particular book, this particular project and this might be true for other things I've written too, because I'm a short story writer also, and I like chance meetings between unlikely characters who somehow find themselves, having to be around people they might not choose to be around. And we all do that to a certain extent, right? We all work and, have uncomfortable relationships sometimes, but this is more of a social thing. And that's what this book is about, there's a misanthropic Iraq War veteran, and he unwittingly becomes involved with these children. So in a way, it's almost like sudden parenthood is thrust upon him, and it leads to some interesting problems and circumstances.
That sounds fascinating. Is that kind of a theme that you've seen pop up in your work? 'Cause I know you've said that it's like this kind of being in a situation like that, but is parenthood a theme that you've noticed?
Well, that is true in this case, but it's not always children and adults. And especially some of these are short stories. But I somehow, at the time, maybe it was because when I started it, I still had children at home, and there's just so much chaos where there are children. And so, especially in this case, because the mother has actually temporarily abandoned them. She relies a lot on the elder daughter, who is 13 in the novel, and she relies on her a lot at home to take care of her younger siblings. And so she says, hey, look, there's this guy I went to high school with. I know we're on vacation, but I'm going to go with him to this resort island. And so I'll only be gone a couple of days. So the elder daughter, finds herself on this barrier island. By the way, she is terrified of global warming. She knows a lot of science. She studies science, and she is terrified of that. So she has never even seen the ocean. She's from the Midwest. And so every time she looks at it, she just thinks, okay, the beast that must be fed. The ocean is constantly eating away the land, which it is, right? And so it's an interesting circumstance.
Sounds so beautiful. I cannot wait to read it. I was like doing some research into it, and it's such a fascinating premise. Where did you get the idea for it?
That is such a good question. I am not really sure. I wrote when I was in graduate school getting my MFA. I wrote a short story using these three characters, and I set it on the coast. And I used to live on a barrier island off the coast of South Carolina. I lived there, I think, for 5 years, and so I think that landscape, given that it's so unstable, especially now we know how unstable it is just seemed like a perfect setting, because the whole beach ecology, the whole coastal ecology, you have the ocean out here, and then you have an island, and this is typical, an island or something dotting the coast, and then behind it you have this marshy territory, these inland channels, and then beyond that, a little farther inland, but still kind of sopping, and really these areas are so important ecologically. The islands are, the outer part of this landscape, which is behind that. There are these inland channels, and then behind that, there's a marsh area, which soaks up a lot of any kind of, hurricane damage and stuff like that. Usually, if there is a wide area of marsh, it's going to capture all that. And so just the whole landscape and its function is so interesting to me. And that's part of, the charm of the setting.
Was that that global warming theme and like her constantly thinking about that setting, was that in it from the beginning? Something that you kind of came to?
It really developed over the course of the novel. I'm not sure that was really in the initial short story at all. It's been a while since I looked at it. But of course, it grew over time, just like the problem, has intensified. And, every day we see some evidence of it. So, yeah. So I would say that grew.
Yeah, that makes sense. How did you know that you wanted to go back to this story? Was it kind of like staying with you after you wrote it, or was it like you were looking back through old drafts? Or I just want to know what that moment was like.
Well, I wanted to write a novel, and I was surprised I thought of it because I went to graduate school just thinking I would work on short stories because I had previously been a journalist. And I thought, well, naturally, I loved journalism, but I loved reporting on things. And for some reason, God only knows why, once I actually got into it and realized how difficult it was, um, you know, uh, I just thought, this would make a good novel because there are already 3 children and 2 grown-up characters. And so all I had to do, which sounds like I'm treating it lightly, but it was a lot, is build the story. I had to build backstories for everybody. The mother, Lucille's mother, and her father, who is deceased. Her father died when she was, I think, 5. And so, maybe even younger. She, I think, he has been dead for 10 years. He was a veteran also and got killed in the war and the Iraq War. And so her mother has been grieving pretty much all this time, but not in a traditional way, in the way of people covering up their grief. And so the mother is troubled. So once I got everybody's backstories, and that's kind of critical with novel writing, you have to know the characters almost better than you know yourself.
Yeah, I do want to hear a little bit more about that process, that building out the characters. Are there some tools that you used to kind of flesh that out, or did it just sort of come to you?
Well, there are tools, I mean, if you go like these days, and this relates actually to another question that you had been interested in, and that is, how I really started uh, writing fiction, which I started in college, which for me was a good while ago. And in that era, not only did men dominate publishing as authors and, of course, probably agents, but also there was this prevailing notion, at least where I was in college, that writing couldn't really be taught, that it was just something you could do or not do. And so I took a creative writing class. I was a sophomore in college. I thought, well, I didn't really write anything that was very good. So I guess I really can't write. And so I didn't get back to it until several decades later. But now there's just great instruction everywhere. You can find Zoom workshops, you can find checklists, author checklists, and every day there's another Substack popping up, including mine, with tips and tricks on how people have learned various things. But when I was actually writing, which was in the 70s, that just wasn't true. It just wasn't, as common to have everybody thinking that they can write. And now the notion is completely different. Now, pretty much anybody can write, and they really can, because it's part of it is inspiration, but part of it is a craft that you learn.
And it's a practice too. You
It
can
is
be
a
like
practice.
so talented, but if you don't write, you're going to fall behind people that maybe didn't have those base level skills as much because they're the ones writing still.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
So you went to school for journalism, you said?
I did. I have a master's in journalism and that was after another craft career. When I knew I was going to be some kind of artist. And when I writing what didn't seem to be panning out, I started trying to learn pottery. And was something I really loved. I really loved the feel of the clay. And that I learned right away that you cannot make a pot unless you are willing to make dozens and dozens and dozens that just completely flop. And that was a good experience for me because you get better and better and better. You sit down at the wheel and you make 100 cylinders, and, after the end of those 100 cylinders, you're going to be a lot better than you were. And I did that for 10 years in Chicago. I worked in Chicago at a group studio there, and it was a wonderful experience. And at the time, I became interested again in writing, using that, the opposite side of my brain, the more intellectual and more, literary. And I missed writing, and I was always a voracious reader. So I was reading some great books, and I decided to take a class in magazine writing, and that led me to apply to Northwestern's journalism school, and I got a master's there and became a reporter. Again, a skill that you get better and better and better at the more you write, the more adept and the quicker. And then, of course, that led to writing fiction. And fiction, because I was reporting the stories, and even a lot of times they were good character-driven stories because you meet so many interesting people who are in the news. But I feel like fiction offers a deeper experience to readers. And I don't know if this is a common notion or not, but I just feel like, for instance, everybody probably is going to read, if they haven't already, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which is a great book centering on the opioid crisis. And there are many, many, many great nonfiction treatments of the problem with lots of anecdotes and lots of character stories from real people. And yet, when you're reading about Demon, the main character, you invest in him to such a great experience that it brings that whole opioid terrible, terrible situation. It brings it home to you in a way that just reading about it can't, because you're just so invested in his welfare.
Well, when you're reading about someone who's real, and this is just my personal beliefs, that when you're reading about someone who's a real person, you can't be connected and brought in the same way because you know the entire time that they're a real person, and you can't project yourself onto them because you're going, well, this is someone who I don't know, who has a whole life, who is not me.
Right.
But when it's a character,
that's right.
They can become a part of you in a different way.
And if the writing, is depending on the point of view, I mean, if it's immersive enough, you really become that person, that character when you're reading.
Do you ever have that experience when you're writing, that you feel like you're becoming the character?
Well,
you're connecting with them that way?
I do. And in this book, Everybody Here is Kin, I use two different points of view. I use a first person point of view, a very immersive point of view for Lucille, the 13-year-old girl. And I felt like I could feel what she felt. I felt like I was her. Whereas with Will, not only am I using the he pronoun, but so he's in third person, but it gave him a little more distance from her. And as a I guess I feel like I'm 13. So I think all of 13 sometimes, even when we're grown up or so-called grown up. So I did feel like I was identifying with her, with her fears, and she's terrified and she's passionate and she's mouthy. And so I did identify with her.
That's so cool. Yeah. So when you're writing your short stories, how different is that process for you of outlining, creating characters, all of that sort of thing?
It's still quite a bit of work. Even if you're only writing, and these days people are writing shorter and shorter, right? So even if you're only writing 1,000-word story, you still have to know. You still have to know the people. And so, yeah. So it's not exactly a shortcut. It's not easier. In fact, it's probably harder. At least with a novel, you can kind of let yourself go and relax and spend a few pages discussing their backgrounds and that kind of thing, as long as it's really compelling narration. But with a short story, you don't really have that kind of space.
Yeah, but when you do have some backstory put in, people can feel it though. So that does
Mhm.
make sense that when you're saying that you need to like still put in so much work for that.
Yeah, because you have to know them, and then you write with authority. I mean, that's where the word author comes from. You have to be able to write with authority about the world you're trying to get people to buy into.
So, what did your path to publication for this book look like?
Oh, well, that is a real interesting process, and I think mine is probably pretty typical. When I first started thinking about publishing it, I went to conferences. I sat in on panels with literary agents who, joined the Authors Guild. I tried to educate myself about literary agents and practiced writing query letters. And it takes a lot of queries to actually get an agent. And I actually did not get an agent. I sent out maybe a couple of dozen queries, and I could have kept on, but I really wanted to get the novel out there. And so I sent it and then here's the other great thing. I think we're in this wonderful era of literature now where it's such a rich landscape of independent presses
Oh,
popping up everywhere. And so I sent a query to an independent press, and they liked it and offered me a contract. And so I thought, I'm just going to go ahead and take this and then get it out there and market it. And I'm glad I did. It's a Madville Publishing, and they've done a really good job with the book. It's a beautiful looking book. So I'm not joking about the era we're living in. There just are so many underrepresented voices now out there, and there are opportunities for many different types of authors to be published. And so it's rich. It's a rich landscape.
it has changed a lot and much needed also. Very, very much.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what is it like? So you mentioned starting writing fiction like in the 70s and stuff. So now how has that changed for you?
Well,
Evolved.
you mean the publishing or the writing or both?
Either way. Either way, if either one has changed.
Well, certainly, there's always been really, really great literature out there, and there have always been authors who were able to, penetrate the male-dominated publishing industry, and there have always been wonderful female writers. I sometimes when I read the authors from previous generations, like Catherine Ann Porter and women like that, it's surprising how modern, how contemporary their short stories and their books are. And so I always like to go back and read those early great authors and wonder really how they did it, how they were able to, bring themselves up in that environment. Because I mean, I grew up in a family where, I mean, my parents, graduated from high school, but they never went to college. They didn't. And my mom always loved to read, so we always had books. But it wasn't like I grew up in a literary household, right?
Mhm.
And I grew up in South Carolina, which is not known for its fantastic educational system, although it's much better now. But yeah, the world has really changed, and it's just far richer. I just read so many books. I read a book recently that was so good. It was about an 11-year-old girl in, um, I believe it was in Nigeria, but it's called The Girl with the Louding Voice. And she, is being sold, essentially sold, for food to a husband at 11 years old. And it sounds really depressing, and that part of it is depressing when you think that kind of stuff can still go on. But it was just such a good story, and I was just glad that the author had written it.
Yeah, and it has changed a lot, like with accessibility, the fact that those stories are going to be out there published for a mainstream audience, like, and people can really see it.
Right, right, right.
That kind of leads me into another question, which is, are there any books that you've read that were so good they changed the way that you write?
Well, I would say almost every book I read changes me a little bit, changes my skills, because I'm always on the lookout for the ways that authors do certain things, the way they weave in backstory or the way they add texture to their work without adding a lot of weight. Because the last thing you want to do is go on and on and on about something and have your reader, start to yawn. So you have to keep the plot engaging. But I'm always looking for ways that they give you a little something extra, in terms of insight and understanding and depth, because that's what you're always looking for. Because when I first started writing, I was so surprised. And somebody who was helping me a little bit with the novel, I even said to him, I said, well, it feels like I'm just writing, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And he just laughed and said, well, you are. But in between there, you have this, for one thing, the diction itself, just the words can make such a difference. And poets
Oh,
know this, of course. Just the words that they're using can carry weight, a lot of weight, or not as needed. And so all of that, developing all that, really takes practice. And of course, as a journalist, I did some of that, especially if I were, feature writing. But yeah, it just in novel writing, it really is crucial because you have to give the reader a minute to process kind of what you're saying. And the way to do that is by giving them a little something extra, but not necessarily a lot extra. Just a couple of words, really sinking down. Not again, and I'm sure you've heard this, and I'm sure every author that you have on here says show don't tell. But yeah,
it works though.
it
It's
does work.
good. So people shouldn't say it forever.
Yeah, right, 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 right. I agree.
One of the most fascinating things I've ever learned about writing is like really looking at what words people skim over.
Oh,
Because
that.
there's certain ones, like when you're writing, you're thinking, oh, well, I'm just saying this happened, then this happened, and then he said, then she said this, and like it goes on and on like that.
Right,
But when people are reading it, you're not looking at those words a lot of the time because they just
right.
become part of the background.
Right, right. And that's why scenes are so engaging. And I think that really changed my work a lot is when I focused on writing scenes and very almost in a prescriptive way, like two or three characters interacting over something, probably disagreeing about something because that's where sparks, can happen, even if it's not a fight scene. And then the mood changes a couple of times in that scene. And so you really have and immersed yourself, in that moment in a character's life. And if you can get readers to do that, to really be immersed in that, then I think that really helps a lot.
And I think it can help the author too have a deeper understanding of the characters that they're writing and the world they're writing in, because sometimes they'll surprise you.
That's a super insight for you to bring up because that is absolutely true. I find that even with a story, and I'm writing more flash fiction now, like a lot of people are, and even with a flash story, I have to get write what I call off the page about something and write some scenes just so I know the character. And that's the best way to get to know a character is just throw them into a scene with
Oh, yeah,
and so otherwise, you don't know what they're going to do.
absolutely. So you're obviously a very artistic person. What was that like for you growing up?
Oh, well, I don't remember thinking about art so much growing up. In fact, I really didn't take art classes in high school. And I certainly was not one of those people who can draw, just from like I have friends who, well, they've been drawing since they were, probably 3 or something. And I just wasn't like that at all. But when I discovered clay, I was in college then. And when I discovered clay, that was just a whole different insight that I could actually learn an art. And, now I wish I had learned that sooner when I was younger. But again, I don't know, it just wasn't part of our daily experience. We had an art teacher in high school, but honestly, one art teacher and like 2,000 students at the high school. So
Yeah.
it just wasn't. It really wasn't. And even looking at art, like now, ever since I was in college, luckily I went to college not too far from Washington D.C., so I could take the bus into D.C. and go to the National Gallery and just stand for hours, in front of paintings and stuff. And it just adds so much to your life.
Oh, absolutely. It's really interesting that you say that it wasn't around as much when you were younger, because I feel like that isn't talked about a lot, where people are like, oh, I'm a writer now, I'm an artist. I've always been interested, but a lot of times you have to kind of find your art and find the way that it works for you.
Right, right. And especially then, I think it wasn't. I think now, like I was saying with writing, and the same is true with anything else, any other kind of art too. If you want an art class, there's one right around the corner, unless you really live, in some rural area that has nothing. But yeah, you can find almost any kind of art. You can go to YouTube and
Yeah.
and learn stuff. Seriously.
I mean, really, yeah, you're saying around the corner it is, but it's also in our pockets and in
Yeah.
our everywhere.
That's right. It seems like it's in the air. And, I think all of that is really a good thing. I think it's just great to have people. Sometimes I teach classes at a community writing center here in Charlottesville, and it's always great to have people in there who have stories, so many stories, but don't really know what to do with them. And it's always such a joy to help them discover how to mine their own experience, because they don't know it. They don't know their experience is special.
Absolutely. Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been wonderful to talk.
It can't be time to stop. This is
I
just so
know.
much fun.
Well, I think that means that you have to come on again once you have your next book, is what
Oh,
I'm getting
good.
at.
Yeah, good.
I just have one last question. That's what do you have coming up?
Oh, in terms of this book, I have several book events, one of which is taking place on my childhood beach, which it was also a barrier island, where my family went for maybe a week for several summers. And so that's going to be exciting. It's called a movable feast, and they meet at a restaurant, and people sign up in advance. It's actually a class at a community college, and then you meet there at the restaurant at this beach, and they have an author come and speak about their book. So I'm excited about those book events, and I have another project in the works that's actually based. It's a fictional version, but it's based on my experiences becoming an artist in the Midwest, which was not only a humongous change in climate for me, moving from the South to the upper Midwest and Chicago and Milwaukee, but also just establishing a studio there was a major accomplishment and something that I didn't think I could do. But I did do it. And so I'm sort of loosely basing it on that experience. And it's just been a lot of fun to go back and revisit a lot of those memories.
Oh, it sounds incredible. I cannot wait to read it. I'm from the Midwest and like right outside of Chicago. So
Oh, you are? Oh,
yeah.
good.
So it'll be a local read for me.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
well, thank you again for coming on. This has been absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. And just send me the details of when I can listen and urge my friends to listen.
I will absolutely. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm BettyJoyce Nash.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end. Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast.
You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.